In the year 1879, Montana was a land still carving its identity between wilderness and civilization, a place of frozen rivers, rough saloons, and the feverish promise of silver. Amid the jagged ridges of the Crazy Mountains, a small settlement known as Red Hollow was born almost overnight. It began with a rumor. One prospector returning to town with pockets heavy and eyes alight, claiming he'd found a vein of silver that glittered like lightning trapped in stone. Within weeks, tents turned to cabins, and the lonely ridge echoed with the sound of picks striking earth. The Whispering Mine, as it would later be called, was not yet a name. It was just the hollow shaft, a place of sweat and hope. The miners were men hardened by distance and danger, immigrants from Ireland and Wales, veterans of the Civil War, wanderers who had buried more friends than they could remember. They worked 12-hour shifts beneath timbered ceilings slick with moisture, their lanterns swaying, their breaths turning to mist. At first, Red Hollow thrived. The bars were full, the general store sold out of candles faster than it could order them, and a single train line from Helena began carrying out sacks of ore that glittered beneath the sun. The mountains seemed generous, almost forgiving, until the murmurs began. The first man to mention them was a young miner named Caleb Dunn, a quiet fellow known to hum old hymns while he worked. One night, he told his bunkmates he'd heard someone calling his name deep in the tunnels. The others laughed it off. Echoes were common in the mines, voices bouncing off rock until they seemed to come from behind you. But Caleb insisted it wasn't an echo. "It said my name," he whispered. "Not like sound, like breath." The next morning, he refused to go back down. 3 days later, he vanished. As more men entered the mine, more stories surfaced. Some claimed they heard a woman singing, distant and low, as if carried on a hidden current of air. Others said they heard whispers threading through the stone itself, soft, urgent, too close to ignore. Foreman Elias Kerr dismissed the talk, telling the men the sound came from shifting rock or water pockets beneath the earth. But even Kerr began to notice the unease. Men stopped talking while they worked, straining their ears instead. Lanterns burned lower, though no one could say why. In the evenings, when the miners returned to camp, a strange silence settled over Red Hollow. The saloon piano went untouched, and laughter seemed forced, nervous, as if each man feared to draw attention from something listening just beyond the walls. What had once been a place of prosperity began to feel haunted, not by ghosts of the dead, but by the mountain itself. The miners spoke less of silver and more of survival. The Whispering Mine had begun to live up to its name, and the echoes that rose from its depths would soon turn Red Hollow from a beacon of fortune into a place no man dared to call home. The whispers grew bolder as the days sank into the dark chill of a Montana winter. What began as faint murmurs soon twisted into something deliberate, intimate, personal, impossible to ignore. The miners no longer dismissed the sounds as tricks of the ear. They began to swear with trembling voices and sleepless eyes that the mine knew their names. Men heard their mothers' calls echoing from the depths, tender and familiar, urging them deeper into the black. Others claimed to hear children's laughter echoing between the supports, children who had never set foot in Montana. Some miners refused to speak of what they heard at all, only shaking their heads, faces pale as the candlelight that barely cut through the gloom. One evening, a Welsh miner named Evan Price stumbled out of the shaft just before dawn, his face streaked with soot and tears. He told the foreman he'd heard his brother's voice calling from the lower tunnels. His brother had died years before in a mining explosion back in Cardiff. The voice, he said, was clear, calling his name, pleading for help. When Evan followed the sound deeper, his lamp began to flicker, and the air grew tight and metallic, thick with the scent of burning copper. Then the voice changed, whispering not in the tone of his brother, but in his own. "Come down," it said. "It's waiting." Evan refused to go back underground after that. A week later, he was found wandering the outskirts of Red Hollow barefoot in the snow, muttering to himself about a voice made of stone. The mine had become a labyrinth of confusion and paranoia. Workers began refusing the lower shafts, claiming the echoes there didn't bounce back the way they should. When a man shouted, he said the sound returned changed, warped, delayed, as if something else was repeating him. Lanterns extinguished without wind, and the constant drip of water on rock began to sound like tapping fingers. The miners' superstitions deepened. Some wore crosses made from ore wire. Others carried scraps of mirror to reflect the voices away, but none of it mattered. The whispers followed them beyond the tunnels. At night, men lying in their bunks would wake to find the sound beside them, whispering from within the walls or from under the floorboards. It spoke in their own tongues, Irish, Welsh, German, English, and always with the same message: come back. The foreman, Elias Kerr, tried to keep order, insisting that fear bred madness. But even he was not immune. One night, while making his rounds through the deserted upper levels, he paused to relight a lantern and heard his wife's voice, a woman dead from fever 2 years before, softly singing the lullaby she used to hum before sleep. The flame in his hand trembled, and though he stood still, the song moved around him, circling, fading, then returning from behind. He did not write about that night in his journal, but the next morning he looked 10 years older, his hands shaking too much to hold his coffee. The men whispered among themselves that the mine wasn't just echoing their sounds, it was learning them. The first death inside the whispering mine was written off as an accident. A timber support gave way without warning, crushing a miner named Henry Lowell beneath a rain of stone and splintered wood. His body was retrieved hours later, twisted and pale, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. But when the men carried him out into the light, one of them swore he heard a faint voice echoing from the shaft behind them, Lowell's voice, calling for help. They laughed it off at first, uneasy and cold, yet not one of them could explain why the sound of it seemed so close, or why it kept repeating even after they'd sealed the tunnel. Over the following weeks, the accidents multiplied. Lanterns burst in sudden flame, tools fell from unseen hands, and tunnels that had been stable for months began to shudder as though the mountain itself were breathing. The foreman, Elias Kerr, blamed moisture and poor timbering, but no explanation could account for the strange way the ground seemed to move beneath their boots, like something shifting slowly below. Then came the disappearances. The first was Caleb Dunn, the same young man who had once spoken of hearing his name whispered in the dark. He descended one morning with the first crew and never came back up. No one heard a scream, no collapse followed, and when his team returned to search, his lantern was still burning on the rock floor, the flames steady and untouched by draft. Days later, a second man vanished, this time from the main shaft, only a few yards from his comrades. They found his pickaxe wedged deep into the wall, as though he'd swung it in desperation. From that day on, the men worked in pairs, refusing to enter the lower tunnels alone, but fear did little to protect them. 2 more were lost within the month, and when a rescue team was sent down to locate their bodies, they found something that turned even the bravest pale. 3 sets of footprints pressed into the soft clay at the lowest level, but each set ended abruptly, mid-stride, as if the men had stepped into nothing and vanished. When bodies were found, they were never as they should have been. Limbs bent at unnatural angles, faces contorted not by pain but by something closer to awe, and always that same expression of listening frozen in their features, ears tilted, mouths slightly open, as if they'd heard something just before the end. Kerr began to lose control of the crew. Men drank heavily, muttered prayers before descending, and some refused to enter at all. One night, a miner who had been part of the last recovery detail broke down in the mess hall. He swore he'd heard one of the missing men calling to him in the dark, begging him to turn off the light. When pressed, he could only repeat the phrase, trembling, eyes vacant. The next morning he was gone too, leaving behind only his boots and a lamp still flickering at his bedside. The mine, it seemed, was claiming them one by one, without noise, without reason, and without mercy. Elias Kerr had always been a man of order, one who believed that every mystery could be solved with patience, discipline, and a clear head. But as Red Hollow's mine grew darker in reputation and in truth, even he began to unravel. His journal, recovered years later from the ruins of his cabin, offered a haunting glimpse into his slow descent. The early entries were practical, notes about ore yields, equipment maintenance, and complaints about the men's superstitions. Then the tone shifted. His words became erratic, written in bursts, as if scrawled under duress. "They're hearing more than echoes," one line read. "Sometimes I think I do too." Another, written days later, simply said, "The walls breathe." Kerr began making nightly inspections of the tunnels, carrying a single lantern and a small revolver. He claimed he wanted to prove to the men that nothing waited for them below, but some said he feared being alone in his own cabin more than the mine itself. In one entry, he described pausing at the entrance of Shaft C and hearing soft tapping, steady, rhythmic, like the beat of a hammer against hollow wood. He followed the sound deeper until the air grew colder, almost wet. When he finally reached the end of the tunnel, the noise stopped. He waited, listening. Then, faintly, the tapping resumed, this time coming from behind the wall itself. "It followed me back," he wrote that night. 3 taps every few steps. I turned the lantern around, but nothing was there. In the weeks that followed, Kerr documented a growing number of phenomena. Tools left on shelves vanished overnight and reappeared in impossible places, wedged between support beams or laid neatly beside sleeping men. Once he found an entire section of the tunnel lined with handprints pressed into the soot, each print small, childlike, as if left by unseen hands. The most chilling account came in early January, when Kerr described hearing voices emerging from a lower shaft that had been sealed after the last collapse. The sound was faint but distinct, men shouting, picks striking stone, as though a full crew still worked beyond the barrier. "We dug through 6 feet of rock," he wrote, "but there was no chamber beyond, only solid earth. Still, I hear them." As fear overtook the camp, Kerr tried to maintain authority, but even he could not mask the exhaustion hollowing his eyes. He began to carry his journal everywhere, as if writing the sounds down gave him control over them. One of his final coherent entries was barely legible, the ink smeared by shaking hands. "The whisper came from my name tonight. Not said, breathed." After that, the entries grew shorter, broken phrases trailing into madness. "Footsteps behind me. Someone humming below the floor. If I stop listening, it grows louder." His last entry dated February 3rd, 1880. "Read only, they want me to follow." After that, the pages went blank. When the mine finally collapsed weeks later, no one ever found Elias Kerr again. When the disappearances and cave-ins became too many to ignore, Red Hollow's miners turned to the only explanation that seemed to make sense, one older than science, older than the mine itself. Word began to spread that the Whispering Mine had been carved into cursed ground. The story came first from an elderly trapper who'd lived in the valley long before the mining camp existed. He told the men that the ridge they'd tunneled beneath was once sacred land, a burial place for a vanished tribe known to the Crow and Blackfoot, but remembered by neither in good terms. "The mountain keeps its dead," he said, "and it don't like to be opened." The miners laughed it off at first, but the laughter carried uneasily in the wind, because by then even the most skeptical among them had begun to feel that something ancient was buried beneath the stone. The rumor deepened when a group of Crow elders arrived in Red Hollow after hearing of the accidents. They warned the foreman and his men to leave the mountain be, saying it was part of what they called the Path of Spirits, where the living world and the one below overlapped. According to their stories, the ground there was alive with voices that belonged not to the dead, but to something older, a guardian or curse that mimicked human sound to lure intruders closer. "The earth remembers," one elder said, her voice grave and steady. "It calls to those who disturb it." Her words unsettled the miners more than they cared to admit. That night, few slept, and those who did woke sweating from dreams of tunnels filled with whispering shadows. Superstition became law among the workers. They hammered charms of silver and bone above the mine entrance, painted crude crosses on the wooden supports, and left offerings of bread and tobacco at the mouth of the shaft before each descent. The foreman ordered the talismans removed more than once, but by morning they were always back, hung silently, reverently, as though placed by invisible hands. Even the toughest men, those who mocked the rituals during the day, were seen kneeling by the entrance at dusk, muttering quiet prayers before stepping inside. Some miners claimed they had begun seeing figures in the tunnels, shapes that moved like men but cast no shadow. One night, a team of 3 returned from the lower levels pale and shaking, swearing they had passed a group of people working in the dark. They were digging with their hands, one man said. Their faces were gone, just smooth. No one believed them outright, but no one went down there again either. By late winter, Red Hollow had transformed from a camp of miners into a place of whispered rituals and sleepless fear. The talk of sacred ground became an accepted truth, passed from mouth to mouth like a warning. Some said the mine was not cursed at all, that it was the mountain itself, ancient and aware, speaking through the bones buried within it. Others believed the voices were those of the disturbed dead, forever trapped between worlds, begging to be left in peace. Whatever the truth, the belief took hold with the strength of faith, and even the most rational among them began to feel that Red Hollow's whispers were not made by men, but by the past itself, calling out to reclaim what was stolen. When the Montana authorities finally took notice of the mounting disappearances, they sent a small investigative team to Red Hollow in the spring of 1880. 3 men in total: a state engineer named Samuel Dyer, a geologist, Franklin Whitlow, and a deputy named Grant Hale. They arrived to find the camp nearly deserted, cabins standing open to the wind, and only a handful of miners left to tell the tale. The men who remained were gaunt, sleepless, and unwilling to approach the mine. They spoke in half-whispers, claiming that the tunnels were alive, that they could feel the ground moving beneath their boots even when they stood still. Dyer dismissed these accounts as hysteria brought on by fatigue and isolation, but when he descended into the whispering mine for the first time, the rational part of his mind began to crumble. The air inside was unnaturally still, thick with a metallic scent that clung to the tongue. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the jingle of lantern hooks, even breathing, seemed to echo too long, stretching unnaturally through the black. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Ice formed on the timber supports, though the temperature above ground was mild. Dyer's notes described the sensation of pressure in the chest, as if the mine were compressing the air around them. They reached the lower chambers, where a faint humming seemed to emanate from the walls. It was not the vibration of machinery, nor the rush of underground water. It was softer, pulsing, like a heartbeat buried deep in stone. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but pressed on, their lanterns casting small circles of trembling light. Then, as they entered one of the sealed shafts, Whitlow stopped. He held up a hand for silence and tilted his head toward the rock. "There," he whispered. "Listen." At first, Dyer heard nothing but the faint hiss of air. Then came a murmur, low, rhythmic, words that seemed just beyond recognition. It was not one voice, but many, blending together into something like chant or prayer. Whitlow dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the stone, his face draining of color. "It's talking," he said, barely audible. "It knows my name." Before the others could pull him away, he began whispering back, repeating strange syllables that no one recognized. When they finally dragged him up, his lips were bleeding, his eyes wide and vacant. He refused to speak again for the rest of his life. That night, while Dyer and Hale prepared to leave, the mine gave a sound like a great exhale, a deep groan that rolled through the valley, followed by the distant rumble of collapse. Dust erupted from the entrance, choking the camp in a gray storm. The next morning, when the air cleared, the main tunnel had caved in entirely. Only Dyer and Hale remained, and both swore they'd heard something in the moment before the collapse, a chorus of voices singing softly beneath the roar, as if bidding them farewell. Neither man ever returned to Red Hollow. Whitlow was committed to an asylum within the year, where he spent his remaining days tracing shapes into the walls and murmuring to the stone that the earth remembers. The mine was sealed within a month of the collapse. Iron gates were bolted across the entrance, and a team of state engineers filled the first 100 feet of the shaft with concrete and rubble. The remaining miners scattered to other camps, taking with them little more than their wages and their fear. Red Hollow emptied almost overnight, leaving behind hollow cabins and the faint scent of smoke from their final fires. Official records listed the closure as a structural failure, with the deaths and disappearances marked as accidents. But no one truly believed that. Even the engineers tasked with sealing the mine worked in silence, glancing nervously toward the dark opening as if expecting something to emerge. When the last layer of stone was laid and the entrance finally sealed, the valley fell quiet, unnaturally quiet, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. For a time, it seemed the horror had ended. Years passed, and the forest began to reclaim the ruins. Moss grew over the cabins, the saloon collapsed into itself, and the path to the mine vanished beneath wild grass. But the whispers returned. The first to hear them were shepherds who grazed their flocks near the old site. They claimed that on cold nights, when the wind crawled down from the peaks, they could hear voices rising through the soil, muffled, distant, like a crowd speaking just below the surface. Some said it sounded like men calling out to one another. Others swore they heard children laughing. None dared stay after dark. By the early 1900s, Red Hollow had become the subject of legend. Travelers passing through the valley reported strange noises echoing across the ridges, metallic clangs, faint tapping, and sometimes a low, drawn-out hum that seemed to vibrate in the chest. A group of hunters who camped near the old entrance in 1907 told of waking in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps circling their tents. When they stepped outside, no one was there, but the snow around them was disturbed by dozens of barefoot prints leading toward the sealed mine. Another account came from a railroad worker in 1910 who swore he saw a light flickering from within the blocked shaft, as if lanterns still burned beneath the rock. He claimed he heard someone whisper his name before he fled, never to return. Then came the final story, the one that reignited the legend entirely. In 1912, a prospector named William Harrow tried to reopen the Whispering Mine. Locals warned him of what lay buried there, but greed and disbelief won out. He spent 3 days digging, clearing away debris and pulling aside rusted beams. On the fourth night, a storm swept across the valley, and the next morning his camp was found abandoned. His tools lay scattered near the exposed shaft, his lantern shattered, and the ground around the entrance was covered in what looked like handprints pressed into the dirt, hundreds of them reaching outward from below. Harrow's body was discovered at dawn, a mile from the mine, lying face up in the grass. His eyes were wide open, his face turned toward the mountain. The coroner said his eardrums had burst clean through, but there were no marks of violence. Those who buried him swore that as they lowered the coffin into the ground, they heard something faint, almost too soft to notice, a whisper that seemed to rise from the earth itself, calling his name one last time. What if the earth itself could remember every life buried within it, and every sin left unconfessed? Red Hollow may be silent now, its timbers long rotted and its shafts sealed, but some say the mountain still speaks, to those willing to listen. Maybe it's nothing more than the restless wind twisting through the pines, or maybe it's something older, something that's never forgotten the voices taken by its depths. Tell me, if you stood at the mouth of that forgotten mine, and you heard your own name whispered from the dark, would you answer it? If this story reached into you, if the echoes of Red Hollow still linger in your mind, let your thoughts surface in the comments below. Do you believe a place can hold memory or curse? I read every theory, every speculation, and sometimes they lead us to the next forgotten truth. And if you want to keep descending with me into the lost corners of history, where crime and superstition intertwine, and where the dead never quite rest, subscribe now. Each story uncovers another buried secret, another shadow left behind by time. The past is speaking. The question is, will you keep listening?